Good evening, everyone. My name is Antonia Wunderlich, and on behalf of the British-German Association, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this online event. For those of you who are joining us for the first time today, the British-German Association is a charity and membership organisation that promotes mutual understanding and good relations between the UK and Germany. And part of what we do is to provide a vibrant forum for debates, talks, discussions and learning about Germany and British-German relations. So we regularly put on events such as this one, along with other initiatives such as our monthly newsletter and our podcast series. This evening, we are delighted to welcome back to our programme German-British historian Katja Hoyer. Katja first joined us in 2021 when she talked about her first book, Blood and Iron, The Rise and Fall of the German Empire. And we are very much looking forward to having her with us again this evening to talk about her new book, Beyond the Wall, East Germany 1949 to 1990. I'll provide a link to the book in the chat so that everyone can access it. Moderating this evening's discussion is Jenny Hill, the BBC's Berlin editor, and we'd like to also extend a very, very warm welcome to Jenny. Thank you for joining us this evening. Before handing over to Katja, a quick note on the technology. We encourage you to submit your questions throughout the event. There will be a Q&A session at the end. So please send in any queries via the Q&A function, which you should be able to find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you click on it, you can start typing up and sending in questions. And you also have the option to like someone else's question. And the more likes a question gets, the higher up it goes on the list. So on that note, over to you, Katja.
No pressure on the question thinkers there. So I thought I'd start quickly by outlining maybe the book itself, given that it comes out tomorrow and not many people would have read it by now, certainly not in full, I would imagine. It is a comprehensive history of the GDR, and as such not kind of a personal book or a memoir in any shape or form. But I did write it, or the motivation for writing it was rather personal. So I was born in the GDR in East Germany in 1985, and was therefore a small child when the wall came down. But grew up in the aftermath of all of that, with people like my parents, my grandparents, my neighbors, my teachers, the people around me, who were all shaped by this weird state that I had kind of vague memories of, but no real experience of. And I've often found myself wondering, listening to their stories and listening to their own experiences, and also feeling that there's something specific about the society that I grew up in, which had changed so much in the kind of very short time span. What I would have done in the situations that they were in. So would I have grown up as somebody who was completely averse to the system, hated it, was trying to leave, kind of planning different and daring and risky means of getting out of the country? Or would I have been somebody who completely bought into the ideology and sort of grew up trying to become a party functionary, or somewhere in between, as the vast majority of people were? And that curiosity, I think, in a historian, is hard to ignore over time. You kind of sit there thinking there is this wealth of material out there, not just in terms of written sources, but also in the form of actual people who are still around and who you can just ask questions about what it was like. And so there is this personal angle to the book, and I make a very brief appearance in it myself as one of my sort of witnesses, if you will, of what happened. But more importantly, I'm trying to make, I think, some very important points about East Germany, given that the history of it as a country has been told, I think, in a rather one-dimensional fashion. So East Germany tends to be remembered as the somewhat peculiar kind of this other Germany, the side story to the proper Germany that existed in the West. At best, usually a footnote of Cold War history, something that you might ask in a pub quiz, in terms of kind of details, who was the leader of East Germany in 1989 and things like this. But I think it is more than that. It is quite important, I think, for in the German context as well as in a global context, to understand East Germany better and the East German experience better, because it still has huge ramifications for today. One of the things that was really important to me as a historian, and because I think it has a legacy into the present, was this kind of to dispel this idea of the GDR as one grey blob. So when people think East Germany, they don't think, oh, is she talking about the 1950s, 1980s. Nobody would do that. If you said something about, say, Britain or the US, you know, you wouldn't kind of have its entire history in one kind of still image of kind of this grey blurb in your mind. You'd think, you know, when was this? Who was there? Where in the country was it? There'd be a much, much more diverse and complicated image of the country than is currently the case with the GDR. And this is something that I was really trying to highlight in my book, is that the GDR changed over time. It changes completely, the experience of it changes completely when you look at different areas within the GDR. Mostly actually within Germany, it's been told from the perspective of East Berliners. And that is an important perspective, but it's not the only perspective. Once you move out of East Berlin, as today actually with Berlin as well, I would say it's a very specific, very kind of distinct environment to be in. And once you step out of that, you get a completely different picture. So I was trying to give more range and depth to telling the story of the GDR than I think has been done so far. I start a lot earlier than its kind of inception as a country in 1949 as well. So I go all the way back into the experiences of the people that set up the GDR. I think it's really important to understand where they come from, what their mindset was, in order to understand what they were trying to do when they set up the state. When you think about people like, say, Walter Ulbricht, who was born in the 19th century, so he didn't come out of nowhere in 1949 and had no previous experiences. You have, for instance, an example of somebody who, as a socialist, had gone through a long period of kind of consistent, I'd say, political repression. And I don't mean that in a way that I would judge that necessarily, but this is his experience. So during the early years in imperial Germany, so up until the First World War, he was part of the SPD, of the Social Democratic Party, which was growing in numbers and by 1912 the largest party, and yet had no say in creating the executive in any shape or form. There were constant repressions, they were affected by censorship, some of them were put in prison, the party was banned for a while by Otto von Bismarck. So that's an experience already as a kind of political outsider. During the First World War itself, most of the socialists who were kind of on the extreme end of the spectrum, like Walter Ulbricht, were quite averse to the war effort, and therefore many of them ended up in prison during the First World War and were kind of already at the receiving end once again of kind of opposition by the state that they were in. And then during the Weimar Republic, they had heated violent battles with the Freikorps, these kind of veterans that came back from the First World War, as well as later the Nazis. And then, of course, once they come into power in 1933, that oppression and the kind of violence that they experience turns deadly. It's very, very risky to stay in Germany if you're a communist or a socialist at that point. So a lot of these people, and I include Walter Ulbricht here again as an example, flee to Soviet Russia because they think this is the promised land, this is the kind of actual thing that we've been dreaming of for decades. This is the thing that we want to set up. Let's go there. Not only are we safe from Hitler, but we can help this country kind of build up this kind of socialist utopia that we'd imagined. And then they go there and they find a very different reality. So a lot of them get very, very disappointed early on with the low living standards, the fact that kind of, you know, building regulations and things like this are such that it's actually kind of, you know, dilapidated buildings and stuff that they live in. It certainly isn't the kind of workers' paradise that they've imagined. And then once it becomes apparent that Hitler's kind of rhetoric against the Soviet Union isn't just rhetoric, but will actually turn into a kind of a large-scale war, Stalin becomes very paranoid about these Germans in this country. There were also ethnic Germans already in the country, and he sort of assumes every single person that is vaguely connected to Germany, and that includes the German communists, could be like a fifth column for Hitler. And he becomes so paranoid that he sends out an order to have them all arrested. And you end up with 55,000 people arrested in the Soviet Union based on the fact that they have some form of German connection. And that includes most of these communists. Out of the Politburo of the German Communist Party that existed in the Weimar Republic, who go to Moscow, there's only 2 of them left alive by the end of this war, and that's Walter Ulbricht and Wilhelm Pieck, the first kind of 2 leaders of the GDR. And that's quite telling, I think. When you think with all of this baggage, Walter Ulbricht now gets sent back in 1945 on the same day, incidentally, that Hitler shot himself in the bunker, to rebuild some sort of German state there. You can see how, the paranoia, the experience of repression means that this isn't a man that goes in there thinking everyone's nice. Let's just give people the benefit of the doubt. Let's just trust them and we'll rebuild this together. He's deeply suspicious of everybody, including his own people that he's now supposed to work with. On top of that, I think one of the key problems with this as well, and this is also something I try and highlight in the book, is that you have a political elite that largely spent the 12 years of Nazism outside of Germany. So when you think how deeply pervasive Nazism was as an ideology, it basically touched every single aspect of people's lives. It changed Germany as a country and as a society. And these people were sitting outside of it for 12 years. They come back to a country that they physically no longer recognize. It's sort of bombed, it's devastated, people are starving, they're hungry, there's all sorts of problems that they don't recognize. On top of that, you've now got a kind of society that was shaped by Nazism and also by the experience of war and conquest in the East. That's another kind of horrific side that is a trauma, particularly in the East, is the advance of the Soviet army. None of that they experience. They kind of come back as outsiders. And, just like now, I spent a significant amount of my initial talk on this. I do the same in the book because I think it's so important to understand things like the Stasi, for example, the secret police later, when you think this is set up by people like Erich Mielke, the long-term leader of the Stasi, who was trained in Moscow during these years, then deployed in the Spanish Civil War, and again is somebody who constantly looks over his shoulder, sees enemies absolutely everywhere. And that paranoia becomes the state's paranoia. And I think it's one of the many reasons why you end up with this really peculiar setup where such a small state of only 16 million people develops the kind of most comprehensive surveillance state that has ever existed in human history. And that's quite remarkable. And I think that's too often, it's just one example where one cliche of the Stasi gets taken completely out of context and is little understood in terms of why this actually happened, and the impact it later had on society. However, having said this, so once the kind of state gets out of this early phase, you do actually end up with very high living standards in East Germany. Out of all of the socialist communist states, it had the highest living standards and therefore a different society, I would argue, from what you see, say, in Soviet Russia or also in Poland, in Czechoslovakia. And rather than lumping all of these states together basically into this kind of suppressed poor mass of people behind the Iron Curtain, I think it makes sense to look at the specific situation that people were in. And part of the problem was actually for the regime anyway, that East Germans were actually comparatively comfortable. There was kind of housing supplied, you had a decent health system, the education system was largely paid for. So all of these things are there. People don't have to worry about the basics. And even if the consumer goods are either lacking completely or of a lesser standards than in the West, you still end up with a society where people don't really have to worry about, whether they can pay the rent the next month or whether they can send their children to university, because these things are provided. And that's also an aspect I'm trying to highlight in the book, because that's, I think, one of the reasons why people today in East Germany and also in other states that were once part of kind of a similar system, sometimes feel that they've also lost something when the Berlin Wall fell. And this is creating a lot of resentment today, because the kind of inherent risks of capitalism that come with the chances were never really on people's radar. They just assumed that this kind of safety net that was there will always be there and it's not something to worry about. But on top of that, you get, I don't know, your Walkman, your TV, your Audi, or whatever it may be that people were dreaming of. When they watch Western television or listen to Western radio stations. So I think just understanding what life was like is really helpful, I think, for the German situation as such, but also more widely looking at the European context. And in order to do that, I tried to show the GDR or tell the story of the GDR from the perspective of its own citizens. So I start almost every chapter with like a little anecdote or an example, like a personal story of somebody who's experienced an aspect of what the state was doing. themselves, so that it becomes kind of apparent what the actual policy meant for people that were experiencing this sort of, new law or whatever the government was trying to do. And that's highlighted some really quite complicated stories. So where you kind of think of East Germans as kind of victims for 40 years or 41 years, actually, there's 16 million stories there to tell, where people were living lives, they were doing things, they were getting married, they went on holiday, they had jobs, they had identities, they were trying to do things either with or against the state, or quite often both. That really makes for a much, much more complicated and nuanced picture than the one that we currently have. So one example I can think of as a young woman, Regina Faustmann, who was 16 when the state was founded in 1949, and who says that initially there was real almost euphoria, or kind of like a can-do attitude. People wanted to build something. They'd just seen their world collapse. Somebody like her would have only known Nazism in their lives. And they now associated the catastrophe of the Second World War, the Holocaust, the kind of moral abyss that was there, with Nazism, with fascism. And here comes a state that founds itself on this myth of being an anti-fascist thing. This is kind of literally the opposite of what they just had. And she said we just wanted to roll up, our sleeves and try and rebuild the cities and do something, join the youth organizations. She was a Catholic, and joined the Free German Youth, the kind of mass youth organization that was there. Even though she, it's not something that you'd associate with a socialist state and the kind of state-run youth movement. But she said we were all, welcome. We all joined this because the idea was we could do something together and rebuild. And I think these kinds of stories are really interesting to juxtapose against the kind of better-known stories, I think, of people who were in opposition or were desperately trying to leave the state, because they're all part of the story, and it's not just the one side. And my last ambition with this was to try and give the GDR a place in history, its own place in history. I think it is more than a footnote or a side strand or this kind of weird artificial side product of history that kind of just vanished. I think it is, 41 years of history, of German history, without which I think it's hard to understand the 20th century itself, and also particularly the sort of complicated German story. When you think about this, that's a longer time span than the First World War, the Weimar Republic, and Nazism together, and much, much more has been written and kind of been said about this than the GDR specifically. So hopefully, with kind of a major piece of work there, and all of us talking about this now, it becomes a chapter of German history rather than just a footnote or a side strand to it. And I think I'll leave this here so that we can have a little discussion as well.
Thank you so much, Katja. I have to say I was really thrilled to read your book, because I recall seeing a TV report from a British news organisation go out for one of the recent anniversaries of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the reporter actually used the words, life behind the Iron Curtain, behind the Berlin Wall, was drab, grey and depressing. And my colleague, who had been brought up in former East Germany, nearly fell off his seat in horror. But I find myself wondering why we have such a simplistic view of what went on. You very poignantly talk about this being the sort of the history of the GDR being the skeleton in Germany's closet. Why so simplistic?
I think the main reason is mostly that history gets written by the victors, and the Cold War was fought specifically on German soil, with kind of two versions of a state there competing against each other. One lost, one won, and you end up with the winners writing the history. I think that's one aspect of it. I think another problem is that initially people who were writing this history had either been on the other side of the Iron Curtain, so Western historians looking on, particularly, you mentioned, say, the BBC, for example, or West German TV. These were all people who assumed, because they grew up in a world without censorship, that they grew up in a world without prejudice, which obviously isn't the case. I mean, there's a counter story to that, which is so deeply set in people's minds that it's very, very difficult to dislodge it without people saying, you're trying to paint a rosy picture of the GDR, or this kind of nostalgia for the East word is being bandied around very quickly if you try and just say to people, well, look, people did have lives, they did do things. That's the very least, he can sort of acknowledge about this life behind or beyond the Iron Curtain. I think that's one problem with it. I think the other issue is that those people from East Germany who were involved in this are also largely opposition leaders, dissidents at the time, civil rights activists, people like that, who again largely were based in East Berlin, and then very quickly realized that the story or their experience of the GDR was something that fell on open ears in the media world that they were now part of. And so together they sort of, I think, created this relatively fixed narrative of what life was like. And thirdly, I think Germany needed a happy ending to its very horrific history in the 20th century. There's so much upheaval, chaos, the absolute catastrophe, of course, of Nazism and the Holocaust. And it was sort of felt almost, I think, in maybe in a subconscious way, that the division of Germany to some extent was a kind of follow-up from that, a consequence, and maybe even a punishment for that. And when this finally comes to an end and Germany is reunified, it feels like, the proverbial end of history that people were, of course, putting in a larger context. Francis Fukuyama has, of course, got a lot to answer for there. But this kind of idea of the fall of the Berlin Wall as the end of history particularly was applied to Germany, where people just wanted this to be finally the end. Germany had finally properly set up a state, a democracy where all Germans are in it, and it's all good. And to complicate that in any shape or form, I think chips away at this idea of it being a happy ending, which means there's still work to do.
One of the things I found most fascinating about this book is drawing the line between your history and what I witnessed today when I go to East Germany, out into the countryside, out into Saxony-Thuringia, and talk to people who are really disaffected, even now, who don't like the Germany that they're living in and feel very forgotten. And I think a lot of them find it quite hard to articulate exactly what the problem is. There's just this general sense of dissatisfaction. And I found myself wondering whether that can be drawn back to this idea that their history doesn't really count and their experiences are either looked down upon or just not considered particularly significant.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Part of the problem is that they can't A, articulate it, and B, that there isn't really a medium for them to do that. When you look at how many people are actually in politics or the media or any kind of forum where you can express such opinions with an East German background, you'll find that there's very little. I think there was a recent book now by Dirk Oschmann has just come out where he calculates it's about 1.7% of leadership figures are East German in background, and that tells you a lot about the kind of even just the forum that people have to express these views. I think another problem is also that there's this kind of cliche of the somewhat stupid, naive, ill-educated East German has lingered and probably got worse actually over time, because it's just assumed that you grow up in a world where the state tells you what to do. There's always this implicit assumption that people went along for it for too long and then suddenly realized in 1989 that really the other system is the better one, and therefore what were you doing for 41 years? Not kind of rebelling against it and not overthrowing the system. So this idea that East Germans are lost to democracy, which is often used and was even used by the very politician, I think it was a couple of years ago, who was actually responsible for East German affairs and for unification, who literally said that East Germans, or part of East German society, is lost to democracy. And I think all of these things mount up to a point where people just go fine, and turn around and turn in on themselves and their own communities. And I think that's a very dangerous situation to be in, and one that needs to be addressed.
That was something that occurred to me as I was reading your book, and actually you do answer this question in your book, but perhaps people who haven't read it would be interested. You begin this sort of new state, all these people, Albrecht and so on, with the idea of creating something new and really democratic, but it very quickly turns into something which is very clearly undemocratic. But no one seems particularly bothered, not the general public. And why is that? Why don't you see more resistance earlier on?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting phenomenon, but you see that in the West as well. When you look at Konrad Adenauer, the first West German chancellor, and you look at this sort of ohne mich, without me sort of generation, that's very passive as well. He gets election results that are mad, like you'd never see that today. having an outright majority at one point, even in a system of proportional representation. That's because people on the whole at this point just want stability and food and prosperity and just kind of the basics, right? They've just gone through a horrific war for themselves. I mean, you could of course argue, they brought it on to themselves. However, that doesn't really, change the situation that people are in at this point. And a war that this time, in contrast to the First World War, actually came home to them. So even civilians are, of course, severely affected by this. And after the bombings and having lost, relatives and having lost a horrific war, details of the Holocaust come out, all of those things, people just want to sit in their homes, have kind of consumer goods around them, have food on the table, have a fixed job. And if you can provide that, then that's kind of all that people want at this stage. And I think this is why people are relatively happy with Adenauer's quite autocratic leadership, even though, of course, he's elected, and I don't want to take away from that. But the left is constantly criticizing him, even at that point, for having this kind of setting up the so-called chancellor democracy, so being quite autocratic at the center of it. Whilst in the East, if they had been able to provide that, and in the phases that they do, you see a real kind of calming down of things. So to give one example, as I was saying, this really early phase, 49, 50, 51, people are quite enthusiastic. They start because they see it as a new thing. Then the regime fails to provide the stability that they need to, and people end up working a lot without there being anything in the shops for them to buy from. They still live in kind of, in the ruins of the Second World War because there's no building materials to build up housing and things. And they become incredibly unhappy. And you see this 1953 uprising involving 1 million people. And then after that, the regime realizes it needs to tone down its kind of communist rhetoric a bit, and also its communist policies. The Soviets deliver lots of foodstuffs and things. And there's a kind of rebuilding phase in the mid-50s. Where the stream westwards, for instance, slows down. It doesn't ever stop, and it doesn't ever go down enough for the East German kind of society to function. But it does slow down, and you see kind of people settle a little bit again. And that is a tendency you see throughout the GDR, that when things are reasonably stable economically, there's less political opposition against what's going on.
You touched on this in your introduction, but when the wall came down, your book describes just how catastrophic actually that was for so many individual people's lives. Do you think that's underestimated today?
Well, I think it's an interesting event in that everybody, virtually everyone that I spoke to, said something had to give, something had to change. It couldn't go on like this. So I don't think even the most ardent kind of socialist supporters at this point realized that things couldn't stay as they were. And I don't think there was an illusion that that was going to be the case. But quite a lot of people had very existential fears that came with this. So if, say, you were a teacher at the time, or a soldier, or a civil servant, or somebody working in the agricultural sector, which was completely overhauled at the end, and this was your life, your identity, this is who you were. And suddenly all of that is coming into question because the structures that uphold this aren't there anymore. There's a real existential fear, what will happen to me and my family now? And in amongst the jubilation, which is the other side of the story, and they both exist side by side, and often in the same people, I might add, this fear is there, and I think that wasn't represented. So there are a lot of people that I've spoke to who say they still cannot watch this kind of jubilation with a sense of, but where's my story in this? Where's the anxiety, the fear, the effort it took to rebuild my life and find a new identity and retrain, say, the same job I've been doing for 20 years because people just didn't think that I'd be able to do it. And the indignity of the whole thing as well, that you were kind of a trained, say, engineer, and somebody said to you, like, what you've been doing for 20 years is wrong. Why don't you go back and learn again, from a West German most of the time as well, how to do it because we do it properly, and all of that. A lot of people don't see themselves reflected in the kind of one-dimensional narrative of 1989.
Speaking of individual experiences, there's a question here actually which I'd like to bring in because I want to ask it myself. This is from Jennifer Tipton, who says, did you look at all at the role of women in the GDR?
Yeah, a lot. I think this is one of the really interesting aspects of it. It's often, so the GDR had the highest rate of female employment in the world. Over 90% of women work full-time. And this is quite often dismissed as a work kind of creation measure where the GDR was always short of labor, so therefore they had to get women in, or the other way around, as one of my reviewers has pointed out, that women were somehow forced into work, and if they didn't want to be a sort of what if they wanted to be a mother and housewife and they were forced into this. I dismiss both of these because just from my own experience, everybody that I know, all women that I knew worked, and they were happy to work, and they're still working, a lot of them who were younger when the wall came down. It was simply a question of childcare was there. You weren't expected to sort of be only a mother and housewife once you had a child. That was one of the things that you were as a person. But you were also, I don't know, a lab assistant or a teacher or whatever you may have done with your life beforehand, and you could continue to do that. So to give you one example, maybe my mother was 22 when I was born, which is kind of sort of the standard age, I'd say, when most people had their children first, because it was just economically possible to do that. And she was at university in Dresden. Now, try and imagine that today, try and study something whilst you have a small child at home is almost impossible, I'd argue. And they were just kind of sort of mother-child facilities where you lived there. You had a little alcove to sort of put the cot and have your child with you in the room where you were staying. And then she'd just go to, say, the lecture in the morning, drop me off at the childcare facility on campus and pick me back up on the way back out. There were other people on campus in the same situation, other young mothers who were kind of supporting each other as well, and it worked. And then you just had kind of all-round childcare shortly after that, from about the first year onwards, which was open from 6 to 6 so that you could work. That was an offer, not something that you had to do. And the fact that women, over time, it took a while. So initially there was a lot of resistance against this as well, and people were saying, with very conservative values still, that this isn't right, and women who choose to do that shouldn't do it because they're not looking after the children. But you do end up over time with the younger generation that comes into the system really appreciating it because, of the culture that comes with being outside the home, being part of a workplace. People say, they wanted to go for a drink after work with their workmates, women, and they could because, the childcare facility was still open and you just go there at 5 or 5:30 or 6 or whatever to pick up your child. So this is very much part of society, and that's why you end up with such high rates and with virtually, as far as I know, no opposition against that. There isn't kind of women's marches out there to say get rid of the childcare facilities because they're wrong. So this is a really interesting aspect of that. And when the wall came down, female unemployment shot up because childcare facilities were built back because they are, of course, very expensive. And that was one of the things that women struggled with a lot, that they were suddenly expected to be looking after their small children at home and not working until children would go to school, which is more of the kind of normal way of doing things in West Germany.
I did hear an anecdote in another book about that particular subject, about a group of West German male doctors who found themselves particularly aggrieved that when they tried to find girlfriends amongst the East German women, or former East German women, they were expected to actually make conversation and entertain them because they couldn't just rest on the laurels of their economic advantage. Let's see. So another question from Steve Voicey. I'm sure it's not a strange question at all, Steve. To what extent do you think the GDR still exists?
In people's minds, I presume, this famous wall that hasn't come down in people's minds. Well, I find it interesting that whatever statistic or survey you look at, if you take the results and you put them on a map, you almost always see the GDR reforming on it. So take something like attitudes towards the war in Ukraine and whether Germany should supply weapons, heavy weapons to it. You'll find that East Germans are much more likely to be averse to that than West Germans, just as one example. But some other examples I looked at for the book, it's just things like how much alcohol people drink. People still drink more in the East than they do in the West, but people in the West drink more wine than people in the East, where beer is kind of the preferred beverage of choice. You could look at when people have their children. As I was just saying, this kind of thing doesn't just go away, and there's still an ambition amongst kind of East Germans to have their children younger. People will say openly things like, I want to have my first child before I'm 30 years old. And so you still see that reflected, although the gap has got smaller. And there are, like, East Germans now also have their children later, just I think for economic reasons more than anything else. But yeah, it's interesting that you can virtually look at anything. Or obesity was another one that I looked at. That's also more of a problem in East Germany than in the West. But almost everything that you look at, put it on a map and the old borders reappear. And I think that's not a coincidence. I think it's too little understood what the societal consequences of the East German state are, and how, how they linger and why they linger.
One of those differences plays out in politics, doesn't it? You have far less engagement from people in the East in what you'd call mainstream politics, much more of a desire to vote, for example, for AfD too, when they are politically engaged. What lies behind that, do you think?
Yeah, that's really worrying, I think. I mean, if you take them all together, again, looking at the last election, 2021, you've got over half of East Germans voting either AfD, so far right, or Die Linke on the far left, or not at all. So that's over half of East Germans not voting for, as you just said, the sort of mainstream of politics. And that's quite something, given the experience that they had and kind of the normal story that we hear, how people wanted all of these things and were voting for them in 1990. I think I wouldn't dismiss that as saying, people don't know how democracy works and they've lived under this dictatorship for too long, because 1990 and 1989 tell a very different story. So these early elections that you have, people vote in overwhelming numbers for what would now be kind of small c conservative parties, who were offering kind of, a free market economy and a very quick transition towards it. So I don't think that is the case at all. People didn't vote for the socialists then in big numbers, or for far right parties. I think it's more the case that they don't see themselves reflected. They feel ignored. To give one example, I think that was the Saxony-Anhalt election last year as well. Maybe it was Saxony, I can't remember. The AfD and the CDU, the Christian Conservative Party, or Christian Democratic Party, the Conservative Party in Germany, they were neck and neck. And it took a long time to convince the leader of the CDU, Armin Laschet, who was also the chancellor candidate, to actually make an appearance and just go there and speak to people. Because there was, once again, this sort of, seemingly, at least that's what I assume, this attitude, it doesn't really matter. They'll vote what they want to vote. There was no interest whatsoever in understanding why almost the same amount of people would vote CDU as would AfD, and how that can be changed and how people can be persuaded to go another way. And I think this kind of inherent disinterest, call it disinterest, I would probably call it arrogance, to be honest, to be frank, is something that is always there and that people feel, and that's making a lot of people very disaffected with mainstream politics. You see similar trends in other countries as well, but there's a distinct kind of East German dimension here as well.
Konrad von, I'm sorry, Konrad, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce your surname because I'm sure I'm going to get it wrong, so please forgive me. You mentioned Mielke's paranoia as a driving force behind the build-up of the Stasi, but it took millions of informers to build the Stasi into what it eventually became. What other factors drove this wide participation in spying on their neighbours, colleagues, friends and family?
Yeah, it's a fair point. It's certainly not something that Mielke could have done by himself. I think one of the factors is just that people didn't take it seriously enough as a thing that should be opposed. Like, you hear this a lot when you ask people why they did it. They'll just say it was just a thing that everybody did. It was part of life. So when you were, say, offered a better, say, a place at university or a higher position in the factory that you worked in, but in exchange you had to spy on somebody, a lot of people did that, and just considered it to be like a dirty little secret that they just kind of keep there because everybody did it anyway. And I think that was part of the problem, is that people didn't perceive it to be something that should be opposed, or that it was just a given, it was just there. Similarly to, when now you ask people, why aren't you looking at your own Stasi file? Everybody can apply for those. And a lot of East Germans have chosen not to. And when you ask them, I've tried to convince my own dad to get his because I'm just interested in what it actually says. And he just says, well, I know what's in it. It's my life. I know what happened. Why would I want that narrated in somebody else's voice? And I said to him as well, why weren't you more averse against the fact that Stasi officers drew you into their office every 2 weeks to tell you, that your mother had gone to West Germany to visit her relatives or whatever. And he just said it was just part of the fabric. You grow up in that system. You think it's normal because you don't know anything else, and you contribute to it when you feel you have to. And you certainly don't go out of your way to oppose it because you think it's so intrinsic, so in there that there's nothing really that can be done to oppose it. That's the only kind of vague explanation that I have for that, is that people just considered it a part of the state.
Question from Stephen Mewers. Do you have thoughts on the use of sport and systematic doping of athletes as a tool of state power and image making in the GDR?
Yeah, it's a really interesting story, that, and I spent a bit of time in the book on it as well. Because again, I think one side has been really well explored. There's been a lot of research into doping, and that's definitely, a part of the story, of course. But the other part is that sport was an intrinsic part of what the GDR was, and of making it a state and creating national sentiment. I mean, this is an artificial line drawn in the middle of Germany that just existed for political and historical reasons, and you now have to convince 16 million people that they are citizens of a state that hasn't existed really much longer than they have. And sport's a good way of doing that. Well, that's what the kind of authorities thought. And so from the off, you have a really extensive sports system where everybody is part of that. You can't opt out of it, which is also something that people talk about a lot, how they had to start a day at university at 7 a.m. in a drafty kind of swimming hall. Because you had to accumulate a certain amount of sports hours over no matter what you studied. So if you were studying medicine, you still had to do your sporting hours every week, which you had to get signed off that you did that. It also started very early on in kindergarten. So for instance, I was targeted for a gymnastics program because I'm very small and compact, and apparently ideally kind of physically suited to that sort of thing. And so I started doing gymnastics at the age of 3, with really hard training every day after kindergarten, and trying to sort of recruit people as widely as you can for those sporting programs. And so say if I had continued that, you end up being pretty good at it, even if you're maybe not Olympic material, somebody will be, out of this mass of people that you have started training at an extremely early age. And that's, I think, also what gave the GDR an edge over many other countries. It's a similar phenomenon that you still see in China, for instance, today, where that's also kind of quite a comprehensive program there, targeting people early and then really pushing them kind of almost against what they necessarily would have chosen for themselves. But you're so young that it just becomes part of your life. And that's the other side. So you have excellent athletes who are very, very dedicated to what they do. It becomes their identity, their job. And then you give them the steroids, the anabolic or whatever it may be, and enhancing their their achievements even further in an unfair manner. And the thing with the steroids is that once you take them away, they leave a permanent kind of increase in achievement as well. So it was quite possible for the GDR to cheat kind of over years and years and years. Just take that out at some point, and the athlete will still be a lot better, especially in females, where it famously kind of altered the physique permanently, especially when you gave it really early. Where it became really sinister was when they started doing it without people knowing that they were doing it. So especially young girls who were given steroids in or before puberty to try and alter them permanently, give them sort of bigger muscles and bigger physique and so on and so forth, without their knowledge in it. And the trials that happened afterwards uncovered, after the wall came down, uncovered kind of the full scale of that as well. So as with most other things in the GDR, there are those two sides. And I think I wouldn't want to take away, because the doping happened, I wouldn't want to take away equally from the massive achievements that many people achieved, without doping, and also just as athletes in general, because the amount of kind of work and life kind of achievements that have gone into those things as well, particularly actually the early ones where that wasn't a thing yet.
I'm glad we didn't lose you to the world of professional gymnastics, because then we wouldn't have had your fabulous book. Sean Bish asks, if you've seen Deutschland 83 and other programmes or films about the GDR, do you feel that kind of drama helps to bring the Germanys together, or reinforce the idea that the GDR was a total oddity? Is that linked to nostalgia? P.S. he says, I'm not a historian, but I don't think you need to apologise for that, Sean.
No, all good. I think it depends how they're done. I quite like the Deutschland series personally, because it isn't entirely it doesn't entirely go down the usual route of just telling one story. I think it is quite complex. And there's also been an interesting shift, I find, from, when you think sort of slightly older productions like, I don't know, The Life of Others, and even the spy films of yesteryear, where it was even more kind of cliched and literally black and white. So I think we've come away from that a little bit, but now I feel it's almost going into this, nostalgic is the wrong word, but it's like a stylish past that's really highly stylized, that's cool almost. I wouldn't want to go there either. I wish people would just make kind of drama or documentaries or material about the GDR that was trying to capture, what lives were like for people there. There's enough drama in that, I think, without making a particular statement about what the GDR was like or what it wasn't like. So I feel it is changing, and it is getting more complex and more perhaps more realistic in some ways. But there's a danger of it drifting into a very kind of stylish past as well, which it really wasn't.
Konrad von Szczepański. One big difference between the GDR and the FRG was that the Russians dismantled much of East German industry after the war. How did that play into the history of the GDR?
It's a huge factor, and one that people tend to forget. So maybe just to briefly put this into context, after the First World War, you had the Treaty of Versailles, and that basically decided, because Germany was held responsible for the First World War, that it would carry all the cost. And so this huge figure of reparations was slapped on at 6.6 billion pounds in 1921. And that many people thought was one of the reasons why the Weimar Republic couldn't really get going and why eventually Nazism happened. So in 1945, people sit there and say, we can't put a figure on this. Well, first of all, it's a completely different scale altogether from the First World War. So it would have been very difficult to put a figure on it in the first place. But more importantly, if Germany is to be rebuilt, they don't want to make the same mistakes effectively that they made arguably made in 1918, 1919. And so no figure is set on this, and all the powers are just able to draw from their zone what they want in terms of reparations. But the idea is that it can be goods, for example, or resources or whatever, so that there's still room for the state to do something, and it's not looking at decades of kind of until we've paid this figure off kind of thing. And the West decide pretty quickly collectively that they won't do that, and they will rebuild, and instead Marshall aid money is plowed into West Germany as it is into Britain and into France. East Germany is not only not allowed to take that, but the Soviets, having completely exhausted themselves in the war, decide that they'll take out what they can. This is basically the main purpose that East Germany serves for them as resources to start with. They take about 60% early on of the ongoing production. So they are like East Germans, they're trying to work and setting the country back up. And as I say, rolling up their sleeves, thinking they can do something. And then the next day, the Soviets will rock up and just take whatever's just been produced and ship it over to the Soviet Union. So that's, I think, on the one side, has a huge psychological effect. Is one of the things that leads to the 1953 uprising, because there's a feeling people are peddling, they're trying to work, keeping their heads over water, and nothing happens as a result. There's no visible kind of progress or people building up, or even people being able to buy food with the salary that they draw. So that's a huge factor, I think, in it. It also, I think, permanently leaves a mark on the relationship between the Soviet Union and East Germany. When you think Adenauer immediately identifies the Americans particularly as an ally, he works with them very closely with them, integrates West Germany into NATO very quickly, and wants West Germany to become a firm member of this orbit, basically to be a direct ally to the Americans, to the point where later on you've got American nuclear missiles and bombs stationed on West German grounds, delivered if need be by West German pilots. It's a situation that we still have now with the nuclear power sharing program. There's no way you get something like that in the East. Like Erich Honecker, even towards the end, doesn't even know how many soldiers are stationed, Soviet soldiers are stationed on East German grounds. He has to look at like water consumption in the camps to try and roughly work out how many there might be. There's still over 350,000 in the country, and he doesn't know how many. So this mistrust, this suspicion, the mutual kind of feeling that the other side's doing something that isn't quite going in the same direction is much more pronounced in East Germany than it is in West Germany. So there's an economic and a psychological component there.
I must say I was surprised at the complexity of that relationship between the leadership of the GDR and the Soviet Union. It really far more complex than I think a lot of people thought. And I think you've probably already half answered Andrea Eckhard-Smith's question, but I'll read it anyway, because you may have more you wish to say. She asks, how influential was the Soviet Union in the foundation of the GDR systems and authorities?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually, because to start with, I mean, Ulbricht and his group, they were actually called the Gruppe Ulbricht, the Ulbricht group, who were like a little task force of 10 men who were deployed by Stalin into his zone of Germany to build up stuff. So there is a direct connection there, in the sense that, you know, they have a directive there to do stuff on behalf of Stalin. But Ulbricht is such a Stalin fanboy, and realizes very quickly that Stalin wants East Germany not necessarily for ideological reasons, because he doesn't, in my view, really consider Germany part of the Soviet sphere of influence. You see this with Putin today as well, this kind of idea that Eastern Europe, where the Slavic world ends, basically is where Russian influence should end, according to Moscow. And I think that's a little bit how Stalin sees it as well. Germany is Germany, and then we've got the rest of Eastern Europe. But he holds on to it for economic reasons. And Ulbricht senses that. And when he's trying to build up socialism in the GDR, one example is collectivization, where the land ownership that was there gets broken down into tiny little segments. New farmers from the east, so people who don't know what they're doing, who aren't farmers beforehand, get given a tiny piece of land, and they're now supposed to kind of grow stuff on it. It doesn't work, and the agricultural sector collapses. And Stalin actually summons Ulbricht to Moscow and says, can you just tone it down a bit? He actually tells him he can't use words like socialism, communism, Marxism for a while, because he just says, just tone it down, just get the country going, because all he wants is resources effectively out of it. So Ulbricht senses that there's reluctance from Stalin's side. There's, of course, also the famous Stalin note in 1952, where Stalin actually offers unification, which I discuss in the book as well, whether to take that seriously or not. But it does instill a sense of fear in Ulbricht that the GDR is like a pawn to be traded in, if need be, for Stalin, and that's how Stalin sees it. So he becomes almost more Stalinist than Stalin himself, building up a kind of GDR in Stalin's image to try and show him that this is worth keeping and it's worth working with and worth taking seriously. But he's always the understudy, always the kind of person that looks up to Stalin, while Stalin is actually quite dismissive of him a lot of the time. And I think that makes him quite radical to start with, is this idea that he has to prove himself kind of to both sides, really, making him quite insecure in many ways. So it's a complex relationship.
Thank you. I'm really conscious that time is ticking on. There's a question from Peter Greenwood about the Economist's review of the book. The reviewer felt that sentimentality and relativism distorts your evaluation of a loathsome dictatorship. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I found that interesting, because the rest of the review is entirely positive, and then this one sentence seems slightly out of sync with it. So I don't know if that's how that came about, but I don't think I have done that. I mean, the book's got positive reviews in the Telegraph and the Daily Mail, where it's got 5 stars. I don't think they're known to propagate things that have a sort of somewhat nostalgic view about socialism. I certainly don't feel that way. I mean, if you want to go down that route, I was quite, I would say, relatively sympathetic towards my interviewees, because I was trying to understand the situation they were in, and was interviewing them not with an angle to try and catch them out or reconstruct their stories afterwards. So their words and their experiences are reflected as they told them to me, unless, of course, there were like factual mistakes and things, which, you know, I wouldn't have obviously replicated. But in terms of what they said, they are in context of my narrative of the GDR, but they are as they are. So that's, I guess, something that you could pick up on, in the sense, you know, why didn't I question, for instance, I talked to a border guard who ended up on the Berlin Wall because he had to do military service in order to get a kind of study place at university. And he hoped that he would get a place in his little town where he lived, because that's directly by the green border in the mountains, basically. And he thought he could just stay there with his mum and his friends. You know, he was 19 years old and wanted to go to university, and just thought he was just going to sit there for 4 years. And instead, the regime took him and placed him there. And I listened to the story how he was sitting there in one of the watchtowers at the Berlin Wall, desperately hoping against hope he didn't have to shoot, or somebody wasn't trying to cross the border on his watch. And that's a story, for instance, I leave comparatively uncommented, because I think that's, you know, something that's so complex and impactful that I leave it there, sitting there as it is, for people to make their own minds up, as opposed to adding a paragraph at the end saying how horrible it all was. So that's, I would say, maybe the bit that they picked up on.
And perhaps related, Mark Wood, who was a journalist working in the DDR for 3 years in the 80s, understands your key point that most East Germans just got on with it, but a significant proportion, he says, were truly desperate to get to the West. Do you recognise that factor?
That's all in the book as well. So there's, you know, this. It's interesting because I'm telling both sides. People have so much focused on the positive side that they kind of ignore the other half of the book, or in their reviews and the way that they talk about it. No, I do spend a lot of time, for instance, looking at people like Peter Fechter, who was a very young, a teenager. And all he wanted to do is get over on the other side of the wall to be with his sister and to live a life over there. And he was not only shot, but then tragically bled to death over the course of you know, a long time, basically, whilst he was sitting there. Nobody rushed to his help or did anything about it. Also, who else have I got in there? Ida Siegmund, for example, who's widely recognized as the first victim of the wall, who jumped out of a window, and the despair, the loneliness, the kind of panic behind that. I also try and capture that. In the 80s chapter, there's a lot on opposition. So the setting up, for instance, of the environment library in East Berlin, and the way that the Stasi completely overreacts by bursting in there in a kind of night raid and dragging the elderly pastor out of his bed, and, you know, all of these kind of ridiculous things. There's a lot on Stasi prisons in there and the methods that the Stasi use in terms of torture. So, for example, I use an example there of a water cell, which is sort of the size of a telephone booth. You can't sit in it properly. You can't stand in it properly. There's water in it at the bottom, ice cold water, about ankle deep, and it just drove people insane until they basically told the Stasi what they wanted to hear. So that side is absolutely there, and I'm not taking away from that one bit. I don't wish the GDR back. I think it was a dictatorial system that had all of these repressive measures. My point is putting it on the map as something that is more than that, because if you reduce it to that, and there are people who literally had never had anything to do with the Stasi in their life, and got on with it, you take their story away from it by reducing it to the people who were affected by it. So I'm just trying to broaden out the spectrum effectively to all of these things.
Let's just have one more question. I know we've only really got a minute left, but I'm sure people won't mind if we overrun by a minute. Peter Barnes, what mistakes did the Federal Republic make in handling reunification? What could they have done better?
I think it was just all done very, very quickly. Economically, in particular, I think a lot more time could have been taken with that. Simply because to try and dismantle an entire state's economy, which was nationalized in the way that they did, created a lot of chaos, and entire workplaces and factories were dismantled and sold off for virtually a symbolic value of 1 mark, which was not only undignified for East Germans who tried to build this up, but also left the entire region pretty desolate. Like when I grew up in Brandenburg, in the rural kind of area halfway between Berlin and the Polish border, and it was a pretty desolate place basically to grow up, and you just knew growing up you couldn't stay there because there were no opportunities, no jobs, nothing, no perspective there, and everybody left. I mean, I'm sitting in a different country, which isn't a direct result of that, but you know, there was no way that you could have stayed. I haven't got a single school friend who still lives in the area where I grew up. So, you know, all of that could have been handled differently, not just with putting sort of telephone lines and infrastructure in place and all of that good stuff that happened, but also trying to think, you know, which of these businesses were actually valid, could sustain themselves, keep them there, try and build them up there, as opposed to very quickly selling them off through an agency, the Treuhand, which really wasn't built up and capable of managing that process properly.
Katja, thank you very, very much. And thanks everyone who put questions. And I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to all of them, but I think that was a really interesting discussion. So thank you very much. And I think Antonia is back now.
Yes, I also just wanted to quickly come on and say thank you so much for this really interesting and very thought-provoking discussion. I'm sure I speak for everyone in that I'm now very interested in reading the book. Very much look forward to its publication tomorrow. Please, everyone, do follow that link in the chat to get your copy. And thank you all for asking such great questions. The BGA has an exciting programme coming up this spring and summer as well. On the 25th of April, we'll be in conversation with Deborah Cadbury about her new book, The School That Escaped the Nazis, which tells the true story of a Jewish German teacher who moved her school to Kent after Hitler's rise to power and continued to educate countless children who came to the UK on the Kindertransport. We're also organising a tour of the BMW e-Mini plant in Oxford on the 5th of May. On the 22nd of May, we are in conversation with another historian, Sir Christopher Clark, who will be talking about the revolutions of 1848 and 1849. And last but not least, we also have our Parliamentary Day lunch at the House of Lords on the 12th of June with the Foreign Secretary. So lots to look forward to. Definitely stay tuned. And in the meantime, I hope you all have a very good evening. Thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you both also for just hosting this, and for Jenny for managing this all so well and asking some brilliant questions. I felt like I covered everything that I wanted to talk about and all sides of this really interesting history.
Glad to hear
Absolutely.
it. It's really fascinating. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.